Lesley Morrow. I'm a professor at Rutgers University, and presently I'm president of the International Reading Association. My area of specialization is early literacy, and I started my work as a very young person, became a classroom teacher, and I taught preschool, kindergarten, first and second grade. I had no particular plans for a major career. I married rather young, and my mission at that particular time, with my mentality at that particular time, was my husband was entering medical school, and I was going to help him through and be the wife in the suburbs. I liked teaching a lot. I liked what happened with the children. I continued to go to school, and I got a master's degree, and then a reading specialist certification, and then a supervisor's and principal certification. And when he was drafted out of his residency to Vietnam, the second year we were in California, and at that point I had a reading specialist certification, and I had been teaching in a lab school on a college campus. That meant I taught children, but college students came and watched, and sometimes I lectured in the classes, and that was my first experience to college teaching. So I applied to, never lived in California. I don't think I'd ever been to California. I flew out myself in the spring before we were going to live there that August, and I applied, looking at the map, applied for jobs in the classroom, as a reading specialist, and in college. And I think because I was a person coming from the East, that was intriguing to them, and I got all three, and then did the college thing. It was a small college in Orange, California, called Chapman College, which is still there, and was there only for 1 year during that Army year, and then we came back, got a job at St. John's University in Queens, and they said, if you want to stay here, you need a doctorate degree. So I immediately enrolled, and then it just, kept going. Never expected to end up at a research institution like Rutgers, but when in Rome, you do what the Romans do, and so I did. And find myself here, which is quite a surprise to me in general. So always loved everything that I did. The writing, the speaking, the teaching, and now this very varied position, as in IRA. So now you can ask me questions.
Okay, great.
And I have a grandchild and one daughter. I have a daughter who's an attorney, and a 9-month-old grandchild.
Oh, congratulations. I have 4 children and 3 grandchildren myself.
Oh my God, you look too young for that.
Some things so. I also, by the way, grew up very close to Chapman.
Really?
Orange County. So it's a strangely small world at times, isn't it?
They used to laugh at my Eastern accent. The students used to say, laugh at me, and I'd say, why are you laughing? And they said, we like to hear you talk Eastern. And of course, I didn't think I had a dialect at all.
Right. It's always invisible to us. Right? The invisibility of that is an issue we'll come back to, huh? So what is the International Reading Association?
It is a organization made up of classroom teachers, reading specialists, administrators, college professors, some librarians. There are 80,000 members in the organization in 100 countries. Our major goal is professional development. We basically are a publishing company, and we have the premier research journal in reading instruction, Reading Research Quarterly. We also have a practical journal, more for teachers, called The Reading Teacher. There is a newspaper that comes out every 2 months about what's going on in the organization around the world. There are 2 journals abroad. One is Russian and one is in Spanish. And we publish an array of professional books all about literacy instruction. We deal with policy, and of late, a great deal with policy. We are collaborating with NIH, the National Institute of Health, and putting together conferences on an agenda for the United States in research. And the first one will be in February 2004. We have councils throughout the country, every state, and then smaller ones in counties. We run large professional conferences, again, for professional development. We support research. We do not teach reading per se, but we talk about the teaching of reading, and our goal is to make teachers the best teachers of reading possible. We do not have one theory about how reading is taught. We accept and welcome varied ideas, philosophies, research, and so on. We are a very open forum.
Excellent. What does the president of this organization do? What do you do?
Sometimes I feel like I'm Miss America of the reading world, or Miss Universe of the reading world. There are certain things that are on the agenda for us to do, like run board meetings. We do strategic planning. There is our budget, of course, and those kind of procedural things about an organization. In addition to that, we are invited to speak at councils throughout the country, or organizations in the States, as well as abroad. This summer I spoke in Estonia, where we had our 13th European conference, which was a wonderful, interesting experience. I'll be in Greece in January to speak for their European Leadership Conference. And I'll be in Arkansas and Montana and those kinds of places as well. In addition to that, we work on the initiatives of the organization as well as our own initiatives, and I have had several that I'm working on since I started, and many of them are coming to fruition, and I hope to continue many of them, even though I will not be in office as part of, as being chair of a commission that I started. I am very interested in professional development and the preparation of teachers. I am particularly interested in preschool, early childhood, because it all begins there. Those two things, professional development and early childhood. And if you got those two things down, I think you'll do very well. So those have been the basic initiatives. I can talk about them more specifically if you'd like me to, or you can ask questions.
Perhaps we'll come back to those. I first of all, I want to say I really appreciate your focus. I also think that, you know, the 4 to 8-year-old range, in particular psychologically and on many different levels, is so formative, and getting that corridor conducted through that particular phase is critical to everyone.
And younger.
Yeah.
And younger. IRA has been an organization mostly of teachers in the elementary grades, and we have not been considered the organization for preschool. And it is time. With early reading first on the federal level, it is absolutely crucial that we make statements about this, that we participate in this. And we have a policy statement in the works right now on preschool literacy development. This is for 3 and 4-year-olds. I am editing a series of books for IRA just for teachers of 3 and 4-year-olds, developed in a particular way that is particularly good for that population. And there will be CDs that go along with them, illustrating key points. We hope to roll these books out at our conference in May and follow up with professional development. And this is kind of new and different for us. It's a constituency we haven't served before and absolutely need to. I've invited the best in the country to write the books. Right now there are 5 in progress, and if they seem to work well, we'll do more.
So this connects to your policy initiatives in some
Yes.
way, right? So you're working with Reed Lyon and people like him to develop policy suggestions that will focus more attention on the criticalness of literacy preparations and development in early preschool.
Hopefully, one of the conferences in the 3 series that we are talking about will probably be early literacy. for preschool. The first one, I don't think will be, but that was mentioned in our first discussion about these meetings, which is very exciting to set the agenda for research in the country with the funding to go along with it.
It also sounds nice to me, a nice fit, that your personal interest and where the organization is going have converged. It's like it's right for you to be helming the ship as it's moving in this particular direction.
Well, I kind of feel like I am moving it in this direction
Okay,
because it
okay.
has, no, seriously, because it hasn't been before, and it is my personal interest. But what is particularly fortuitous is the country is moving in this direction
Yes.
right now, with early reading first and even reading first. So the timing is wonderful. There are people willing to listen. We were just meeting with Pat McGee this morning, who runs Reading First at the Early Reading First, sorry, at the Department of Ed, and very interested in a potential collaboration and coming to a conference with a cohort of the teachers who received these grants to honor them, or actually it'd be a university school collaborative. So it's a very exciting time for literacy instruction in general. I mean, we do have an administration that is interested in it, and so there's a lot of activity. And the activity, I think, is positive for the most part.
At your vantage, I mean, here you sit in charge of this very large organization, at the top of this very large organization, so you've got kind of an extended nervous system in how the practices of teaching reading are working, on a pretty broad scale. What is the state of reading in America?
Well, it has a lot to do with ethnicity, socioeconomic background, multiculturalism. We have tremendous diversity in this country, and we do have a gap between the rich and the poor. And definitively, the research shows that children who come from impoverished backgrounds are not doing well. The increases in scores that are made in the NAEP assessments typically are coming from the children from upper socioeconomic backgrounds, middle class backgrounds. So there is issues on how to address literacy instruction in urban communities. It is a difficult issue. And it is extremely complex. The differences in languages make it extremely complex as well. So it's not easy. And in terms of teacher preparation, which is ultimately, the most important thing in professional development, people constantly say, how come they're not ready? They went to school for 4 years. How come they can't teach reading? Well, you need a lot of experience to teach reading. It's one of the most important things in this world to happen to a person to become literate. I firmly believe that professional development needs to continue after teacher preparation, and that the first year of a teacher's life in a school district should probably be not a year that they have their own classroom. They should be under the mentorship of a exemplary teacher who is proven to have success with children's achievement. You can liken it to physicians and their training, and we have been looking at neuroscience a lot when it comes to the teaching of reading. Well, we probably should look at the medical model when it comes to the teaching of reading as well. When a physician finishes his 4 years, he's not done. He then trains under a mentor for a long period of time. He practices before he gets his own practice. And that, as far as I'm concerned, is probably why teachers sometimes can't do as good a job as they could if they had that extended period. The other thing is the professional development within the school. This should be a part of the contractual agreement with school districts that professional development is just part of the job, and that the school district needs to know how to provide it. And it's not simplistic. It's complicated, and it's constant because children change. Our demographics change daily, and you just can't, you get 25 children in a room that are all different and speak so many different languages. Again, I'm going to make a physician comparison. If you gave a doctor 25 diverse patients all at once, even if he was a specialist, and told him to diagnose them all together, most of them would probably die. And that's what we ask teachers to do. 25 kids with huge diversity in ability, background, interest, experiences. We're asking them to do one of the most difficult tasks. So the professional development needs to continue. We're studying professional development. It hasn't been studied in the past as much, but it has to be ongoing. There needs to be a theme in a school district where the teachers are given some input. There needs to be study groups where they are reading constantly, and some by their own choice, where they are setting goals for accomplishment in that year. And they come back to talk and reflect every 3 or 4 weeks on the readings, on the goals, on their problems, on their successes. You need to have a coach in every elementary school. I don't care what you want to call it, a reading specialist. This is a person whose entire job is devoted to professional development, who helps the teacher with resources that they might need, and also models. This is an exemplary person who can model strategies and make sure that the study groups are being productive. You need to bring in big names, so that's motivating and exciting, but you need to follow up on that sort of thing. Teachers need to join professional organizations because there's a big lens out there. Teaching is not just your classroom. So the full exposure is so important and must be continuous.
Let's go to the 3 and 4-year-olds. What's your sense of the stages of development, the basic methodology of moving from one stage to another from this early beginning age?
Well, are you talking about reading development?
Yes.
Literacy development. The literacy development of a 3 or 4-year-old begins at birth. In some ways, it's almost too late to begin at 3 or 4. By the time a child is 3, their vocabulary can predict their success in reading. Now, that's the bad news if they come from an impoverished home where vocabulary is not rich. The good news is that a good preschool situation can help a lot. Preschool is crucial. There is research on preschool where we followed children from 3 through adult life. And children who went to preschool compared to those who didn't were less likely to fail in school, were more likely to graduate from high school, and were less likely to get in trouble with the law. So preschool can predict a lot and is crucial. Literacy is crucial there. However, once again, the child needs the background before. There needs to be a strong experiential and language background. Music, rhymes, language play, being read to. A child who's had those experiences and comes to preschool at 3 is very different from a child who hasn't had those experiences. And truly, in this country, there are children who've never had a book read to them prior to coming to kindergarten at age 5. In terms of the actual development, language is a very strong component. Experiences give us language to talk about and to build. We also need definitive instruction in phonological awareness and phonemic awareness, which has to do with the sounds of spoken language, the individual sounds, and then the larger units such as syllables and words, blending and segmenting these and rhyming these. It is not a huge amount of experience that needs to happen, but it does need to happen along with the language and the information and the storybook reading.
Let's talk about phonemic awareness. How do you define it in your group?
Phonemic awareness is the individual sounds in a word. Basically is totally a language activity and not associated with symbols. It's recognizing that a word is made up of individual sounds. But you don't have to know that the word cat has a C, an A, and a T. You just have to be able to hear that there's a C, that there's the cut, and the A, and the T.
But is phonemic awareness a requirement of being a good oral communicator, or is it unique to learning to read? In other words,
I don't quite understand.
Okay, if somebody wasn't learning to read, just a matter of just a totally oral culture, is there anything natural to the oral language nature of human communication?
You would probably get some phonemic awareness if you had a rich oral language interchange prior to that. When I say rich, I mean the family that sings with the child is bringing in a rhythm of syllables and sounds and words, and that's how a child gets phonemic awareness. That is what we're doing in school to help them with phonemic awareness. So yes, it is a nature of language development from a background that is giving the child rich language. The chanting of poetry, the reading of books in a different cadence. And I'm going to talk about my grandchild right now because I've been reading to him since he was born. And at about 6 months one day, I was reading a book, and he started, as I turned the page, to read with me. And what did he do? He went, and I turned the page, he went, He had made the connection that a book always comes with a sound from me or another adult, and then he was going to do that too. He already has book awareness. That's a huge piece of knowledge that a child who has never been exposed to. He also did it in a different tone of voice than his other sounds. The that was a reading sound that he made up, whatever. So yes, there is a huge, and children have this natural ability towards and facility for learning the language, and things like music and rhyme and language play seems to be attractive to them, and we do know from the brain, the workings of the brain, that it is programmed that way. And so that syllables in music is phonological awareness, the bigger chunks, and blending and segmenting. When we sing, we elongate certain words and make other words shorter, and we clap and we march, and so yes, that they.
My understanding of this, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, is that in the development of oral language skills, there's not a lot of necessity to pay attention to these distinctions at this level, but it's critical to be able to make those kind of distinctions to map over the
Right.
print of.
I think you're getting a generalized background, an embedded background in your rich home environment, and then in the school would make it a little more explicit for the child. And if they had that rich background, it would come to them very quickly.
Right. So it's almost as if the phonemic awareness is a necessary formatting that will allow for these separate sound systems to be assembled and manipulated to create an internal oral language experience from this code.
Yeah. Phonological awareness is the broader term, umbrella term. Phonemic awareness comes under it. Phonemic awareness is the individual sound And phonological awareness is the larger chunks
Right.
of words, again, that we blend, segment, rhyme, substitute, add to, and so on. Those are the necessary abilities to then go into phonics, and it is considered a precursor to phonics.
And what is phonics?
Phonics is sound-symbol relationship, put very, very simply. It's you can identify the letter and its sound, or the letter chunks, or parts of words, and it's related sounds.
Okay, and it's related sounds.
Sounds.
Plural.
Yes, because, for example, we have groupings of letters such as digraphs, TH, CH, which are two consonants. When they are put together, make a unique new sound, different from the original sounds of those consonants. So a child has to be able to learn the symbol TH is the sound
So,
as in three.
yeah, the history of how that happened is one of the things that we're really interested in, which is quite a story. So basically, rather than in a phonetic system where a letter has one sound and it's very simple, children need to be able to recognize that sometimes
Yes.
when letters are paired together,
Mhm.
they're no longer what they would be individually or
Exactly.
discretely, but they now represent something altogether different.
Exactly.
And maybe not something singular,
Mhm.
right? But each letter may have a multitude of different sounds, and then if combined,
Mhm.
could have a singular sound that's distinct from any of the multiple sounds they may have if they're separate.
Yeah, years ago we tried to teach every possible rule there was, an exception, and it's just not worth it because it's good for one word. So we deal a lot with high-frequency sight words now, because it just is not worth it to try and learn the rules that just don't apply to very much. So you try and stick with the rules that are generalizable, and more with strategies for how to work with the words to find out what it is if it isn't a sound symbol related typical match.
Good. At this level of conversation, and there's a lot of other questions, but I'm attracted to go into this space a little bit more. Is that okay?
If I like the question, I'll answer it. If
Fair
I
enough.
don't, I won't.
Fair enough, fair enough, fair enough. One of the things that we've done is try to, not in order to figure out, like you said, to map out every possible way to spell any possible combination to work out a word, but rather to look at what's the ambiguity? What are the different kinds of ambiguity that the human brain is being challenged to process its way through in order to take these letters, which are seen with the eye, and assemble and construct and project this internal, virtually heard or actually spoken, simulated speech. So what are the processes involved in that, and what's the relationship between all of that and the code, and what are the different kinds of ambiguity that are in the code, and how does the brain learn to do all of that?
I'm not sure I'm going to answer the question you asked, but
Okay.
I may be answering it to a point, and I'm not even sure. Reading is complex, and the code is one part. So, in addition to the code, there are so many other things that enter in to whether you can get the sentence and understand it. So we point out, as simplistic as it might sound, the picture on the page for a very young reader to try and get the meaning from the text. There is the shape of the word that means something, and terribly important is the context, the actual meaning, syntactically, semantically. We will often tell the child to read the sentence and try and figure out what makes sense in there. The code can help them, because after they talk about what they think makes sense, then you look at the word, and does the word match that you came up with match the letters on the page. And, for example, the boy went up the, and the child says steps, and it really says stairs. So then you can really take a look at the difference between, the teacher can write stairs and steps, and you take a look at it, and why would it be stairs and not steps, because of letters in the word. So there are many, many things. It is not simple, and the meaning, as well as fine visual discrimination, all enters into it. The meaning is big, and the syntax is something important too. What typically comes at the beginning of the sentence? I mean, that kind of question. And you give children those types of strategies so they know what to do when they can't get a word, where they fall back on multiple
strategies. So they're
strategies.
compensational in a way for
Yes.
how complex the code
Yes,
is.
yes, yes, exactly. So you don't only depend upon the code when you can't get a word, because it's not going to work all the time.
Right.
The meaning is crucial, and what the whole story is about. So it's a lot more.
Well, I mean, the whole point of reading is to have the mechanics of this assembly process
Mhm.
transparent, so that it's like I'm talking to myself, it's like I'm
Exactly,
thinking.
exactly.
Right? Except it's code-induced thinking that I'm not burning so much brain resource on in the process, but I can comprehend it.
Fluent reading is automatic reading. You're not dealing with the code anymore
Right.
when you're a fluent reader.
Reed Lyon had a statement about this, which I won't go to. I won't try to go out and catch right now. But basically, that in effect, the hesitations, the starts and stops that we hear
Right.
in the articulation
Right.
of someone who's struggling to read
Mm-hmm.
has a correspondence with this confusion they're trying to
Mhm.
process through.
Right, exactly.
Because the brain
Mhm.
is so busy trying to process
Mhm.
through this confusion that it's stuttering up its ability to flow.
Mhm.
So, well, I agree with you, and I appreciate where we're going, that, I mean, phonics is an attempt in the 16th century to compensate for the mess of the code.
Mhm.
We wouldn't need it if the
Sure,
code
sure.
was
No, the
good.
code is crucial.
The picture information, the
Mhm.
guessing strategies,
Mhm.
all these things are compensations to get
Mhm.
around this
Mhm.
confusion
Mhm.
in the code. And that that in a way, children that are, let me just ask if you would track with this, that the struggle that we're seeing in these children and the shame that's going with it and this whole thing is ambiguity overwhelmed with the ambiguity that's a consequence of tracking this code.
I still like to think of it as a broader perspective. You know, I absolutely
too.
100% agree, and research shows it, that the code is crucial to learning to read. But I think in the teaching of reading, we need to think about it as a broader perspective of many different kinds of strategies and skills working concurrently.
Absolutely.
You know, together.
I totally agree with that. And here's where I'm coming from with this children of the code thing. It's my experience from talking to teachers, parents, people all over the place, that they don't understand the challenge the children are going through in the following sense. These children are wrestling with this archaic technology
Mhm.
that's a result of a collision 1,000 years ago between two different language systems that's all mangled and messed up, that people have tried to fix and we haven't been able to fix. And it's straining their brain,
Mhm.
and they're blaming themselves for it.
Mhm. I have an exercise I do with my graduate students who are becoming teachers, reading specialists, and I do it with parents as well. It's in one of my texts, and it's called a Confuse-a-Bet. It's a contrived alphabet. It does have several similarities to our alphabet, actually, so they're at an advantage over children. And I tell them that I'm role-playing, and I do a reading lesson as if they were a 6-year-old, and I have actual materials, little books, and so on. It is so fascinating. I ask them 3 questions at the beginning, at the end, is how did you learn to read? How did it feel? questions. Oh, God.
You're doing great.
But let me do this.
I love this idea, by the way. I
Yeah,
just love it. I wanna get a copy.
it's extremely emotional. They know that I am pretending. They know me fairly well as a person, and I'm typically not that threatening. And yet, I do a lot of punitive things during this lesson, but sometimes they do happen in school. I call on people, even if they're not raising their hand. I will embarrass them occasionally. I will go very quickly, and I will tell them that they can't take the book home unless unless they've really mastered it quite well. Some of them get it, and some of them don't. Like real people, real kids. The redness on the face when they're called on. The ones who don't get it slink down in their chairs. The ones who do are jumping out of their seats like little kids trying to, let me know. And it is fascinating to watch. I had a student that during this experience, just sort of like, and I knew her very well, pushed me away, sort of like, don't call on me. I got her vibrations. And afterwards I said, Linda, what was wrong? So she said, you brought back the worst memories of childhood. And she said, I'm dyslexic, and every memory I ever had, you brought back. And I just couldn't deal with it. I wanted to run out of the room. Now, once again, they know that I'm pretending, and yet they feel it. And how did they learn to read? They learn from background knowledge. They learn from association to what they know. They do some visual discrimination, very little sounding.
If they've got this problem, an adult who can contextualize this, what does a child have who's being told by the entire world there's something wrong with them if they can't do this? It's a massive thing. By the way, I just had a conversation this morning with the Einstein of emotional science, whose work is about the nature of affect and how affect affects cognition. We're in this very same space that you were in right now. You just said a beautiful case. It was just really well done, and I would love to get it.
I will send you a copy of the book, actually.
One of the things that I do, and that we're doing, is to have adults go all the way back to again, when most children are very young, we're exposing them from mobiles in the crib on to seeing discrete letters and associating them with their letter names, almost burning it into them, which sets them up to have an impulse to fail during the takeoff into the learning to read process, because the letter name is rarely the right associative response.
Right. The Montessori theory doesn't do that. It uses only the sound to begin with. And also, again, uses kinesthetic touching of the raised letter. We do learn in many different ways, and some people learn one way and some people learn another way, so you do have to expose a child in many different ways, so you find the style that seems to work for them. And if you know yourself, you know that you have a learning style that's probably different from somebody sitting next to you. Once again, I can't bring the background knowledge and the gap and everything that happens to a child before they get to school. It's not always true, but most of the time, yes. There was this, and this is just a little anecdote that gives you the feeling, a little boy by the name of Juan in a preschool in New Brunswick, New Jersey, where Rutgers is, and it is a disadvantaged community or an at-risk community. And every day he'd come in and sit in the rocking chair and read this wonderful book by Mem Fox called Wilfred Gordon MacDonald Partridge. And one day he came with a dirty sock and pennies in it, and he gave it to his teacher and said, "Here, Mrs. Johnston, I want to buy the book." And of course she gave him the book, but it's a sweet story, but when you think about it, he had no books at home. And he was trying to figure out a way, that he could get one. I mean, it's this huge gap. And then I mentioned my grandchild, who has been bombarded from day one. Family is so crucial to this, and I'll tell you a little family secret too. We make the assumption also that if a child comes from a deprived background, that's the only problem. Well, I just have to tell you this little story about my daughter, who's an attorney. So she comes home with this baby, you know, what do I do with this baby? Anyway, after a few weeks, I said, Stephanie, are you reading to him? And she says, I tried, Ma, but he doesn't focus. So, I mean, she was not getting it herself, you know. Thank goodness she's a fast learner, and, you know, she's kind of getting it. But another thing also happened, too, which shows that you don't, even with tremendous education, you may not get it on how we learn. She was saying what a pain it was to have to drag him to the post office, and, you know, you got to carry him, he's getting heavy, and it's easier to go without him. And I said, Stephanie, he needs those experiences. So naively she said, he doesn't remember anything from the day before. I wanted to curl up, you know, and die. This is not my daughter, but she has learned. She's a fast learner. And that's a very common thought, you know. What is this infant getting out of this? No, they don't remember the exact experience, but the basic experience of being in a different place with different noises and different sounds and different sights, layers.
The difference between the verbal volitional index of recall and
Exactly.
human organismic memory.
Exactly. That gets stored away. So.
Excellent. I had a question down here that you didn't mix.
I didn't like your questions. They didn't resound with me for some reason. Or these are fine, but yeah.
Okay. Yes. Well, I'm actually
Whatever.
interested in whatever evokes kind of your passionate,
Yeah,
essential
and I'm talking
interest
about
in
it. You know,
that's good.
I'm getting to it.
That's
you know.
good. That's good. I do want at some point to cover some of what we're trying to do with this series is to create a sense of the perspective, the dimensions of the reading problem. So the psychological dimensions, the formative, developmental psychological dimensions, the development of the intellect, the cognitive infrastructure of the intellect, and being critical, critically self and other conscious. And then there's the kind of economic, sociological implications. And I'd like you to speak to any of those that you have some passion for, any of those different dimensions of the implications of reading.
Well, there are huge implications for being able to read. There are actually some states in the United States that build prisons based on how many people are illiterate. That's a true fact. That's scary. I'm not going to remember the exact numbers here, but we do have significant numbers that are functionally illiterate or illiterate. And along with that comes trouble with the law as a child or a young person. A large percentage of inmates on death row are illiterate. A very large percentage of those who are incarcerated are. You have reports in the workplace of lack of productivity and extended management supervisory time with people who are not as literate as others. It is definitively a necessity in our society to do well. How you speak is extremely important in this society because it's the first presentation of yourself to someone else. It gives a message of they're smart or they're not, whether it is true or not, because it isn't necessarily true. We have tremendous issues to figure out in this country with the richness of diversity, which truly is wonderful. On the other hand, confusing in terms of literacy and productivity and so on. If we continue to make small communities of different languages, and there isn't a common language, we have the Tower of Babel. We don't have people understanding each other who can communicate with each other. And this is truly a problem. I don't care what the common language is, but there's got to be one. And then we can only enjoy the diversity and the richness of difference. So this is one of the major issues as far as, I'm concerned, or my thinking. My other passion is the family, and there is a breakdown in how we function as a unit. And this affects literacy tremendously. And it, in my mind, isn't only rich or poor either, because the affluent young parent buys for their child things to watch and do, but the interaction is what makes the difference. And the child seems to understand when it isn't the major caregiver, that is interacting with the child. So you can put your child in front of any kind of, complicated computer. It's not going to make that much difference unless you interact with them. There is the social, the emotional, physical, intellectual in terms of learning, and those of us in early childhood know that very well, and they go together to learn completely. And again, if you watch an infant or a baby, you see them working on all of those levels to try and learn. And that's not happening in our families as much as it should. Maybe one thing is happening and not another, but all of those things need to be developed concurrently. If you're always running to the mall, that's what your child is going to do. The other thing is parents are tremendous models for what the children are going to do. Children are great imitators. And what they see is what they're going to do. And I'm not sure families are tremendously aware of that. So I see a tremendous need for work in the family.
Children are always learning, always,
They
constantly
are
extending
programmed.
and differentiating out
Right.
into the world
If-
they're inhabiting.
If you watch a baby, they are programmed to learn every minute of the day.
Right.
They never stop
They're
trying.
born learning oriented,
Mhm.
until they learn otherwise. Oh, this has been fantastic.
Well, that wasn't a very coherent answer. It kind of went around.
No, that's okay. We know how to edit things too. Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you think we should? I mean, obviously, we could spend the rest of the day in here, but
Well, I would like to give, a plug for this concept with professional development and professional organizations. And I'm going to talk on a very personal level here, too. I'm a very different person than I was as a young woman. In fact, then I would have never called myself a woman. I would have called myself a girl. And now I would have called myself a girl also, even though I'm a very grown-up woman. Professional organizations have given me a dimension to my career that nothing else could have. A dimension of experiences, of meeting people, learning from them, from all over the country, then all over the world, materials, books, discussions, reflection, that I would never have had an idea of, and enabled me to keep growing as a person. And truly we have the ability to continue growing after childhood and continue to learn. So my recommendation to young people is that there are many dimensions to teaching, and one of them is professional associations, where you will just enhance you will gain so much from it yourself, and in turn also give, which feels good. It truly has changed my life.
Kind of a supported learning community that you can participate in and really remain juiced and informed by.
And even broader than that, I wouldn't be sitting here. I wouldn't have, well, I have worked very hard with professional organizations to get to the position I'm in, but the breadth of experiences in policy on a government level, I never knew policy existed for teachers. I never realized that reading was political when I was a teacher in the classroom. Never had a clue, you know, that I could possibly do something to affect the policy in the politics. And that comes with a professional organization. So to round out your education, it's a necessity no matter what organization you join.
That's a great statement for the teachers. What would you say to the parents? You've got a few seconds, 20 seconds a minute, something like that. What would you say to the parents?
Well, they're the first teachers that children have, and they're the teacher that a child has for their longest period of time. They are absolutely crucial in literacy development, and the teaching profession needs them for their support of what's going on in school. Not to be the teacher of reading for their child, but to do the supportive things that they need to do. They need to read too, and they need to be at it constantly. It will be the most important thing that they can do for their child is broaden their experiences, read to them, talk. There is a relationship between the amount of time a family spends at dinner and reading scores because of the talk that happens. It was done at the Center for the Study of Reading in the 80s. And it is absolutely true, even though it sounds absurd. They are crucial. They are so important.
The richness and frequency and distinctions in the dialogue is what's preparing the way. With the last few minutes, I would like to give you a little bit more of a final view of what we're doing and share with you some materials about that. I think you got a sense that, like I said when we began here, we are somewhat code-centric, but not to the extent that we're in any way not considering all the other dimensions.
I hope so, because we talked about a variety of things, and every single one of them, as far as I'm concerned, are as important as the other. Now, with some children, the code may be more important than other things, and with some children, they're never going to get it, and so they have to learn to read another way. So
here's what we're interested in doing. We think, people that have gathered together and kind of been part of this thing, its nucleus, that as a society, we generally don't get it about reading.
right.
We generally don't get it. We don't get that it's a technological interface, it's a machine interface process, it's not a natural thing. It's not like learning to walk and talk, which have got hundreds of thousands of years or millions of years in the evolving interior of human beings driving it. This is a relatively recent technological contrivance.
And it's not natural either, yeah, because walking is.
Yes, right, and talking is.
More so than reading. We have the natural facility and ability to communicate, but how we communicate determines what happens environmentally.
Well, some neuroscientists, Terence Deacon, whatever, would talk about, we've been in communication for a million years.
Right.
But we've been in spoken language
Right.
based on jaw and other anthropological evidence for 100,000 years.
Right.
There's no question that we've been reading alphabetically for 3,500 years, and that the majority, 0.0001% of the population has only been reading for 200-300 years. There's no way that we've adapted to it. It's a radical new invention. And it's a technological process not different than driving a car or an airplane or programming a remote control, in that it's the technology, and yet 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds are having life-fading experiences because they can't do it well.
Mhm.
In that sense, they're children of the code.
Mhm.
Isn't that, is it,
Maybe yes, maybe no.
6 minutes? How not? How is it not a technology?
Because you talked about affect, there's desire, there's interest, there's motivation, there's the language, there's what happened to you prior to being faced with the code can often determine your ability to deal with it.
Sure, no question, no question.
That's
But
what I mean.
60% of the children are below proficiency, according to,
Mhm.
you know, the
Mhm.
records. Proficiency with what? Proficiency in interfacing with this technology.
Mhm.
I agree with you, there's all kinds of forces
Mhm.
shaping why this incompatibility exists. But when it comes down to it, we're talking about an incompatibility between a contrived technology and a
Right.
human natural
Right,
brain.
right. There's something else that's happening in our world today, too. I don't think we understand how important literacy is. I think it was appreciated more in some of the first-generation American families than now, and that our world does not seem to revolve around literacy. The way we're constantly moving and doing, as opposed to as much reading that had, happened in the past. I don't think the value is placed.
Back to the point, what are we trying to do here? One is reframe the notion that this is very much like using an appliance or a technology or whatever. This is an unnatural challenge to the human nervous system and brain that most of our children are learning that are having struggling with in some degree or another. And that one of the main consequences of that struggle is that they're learning to feel ashamed of their minds.
Mm.
Most of our children are growing up learning to feel to some degree ashamed of their minds because of the problem interfacing with an archaic technology.
Mm-hmm.
That's a wake-up call. That's part one of a series of points in what we're trying to do.
It's an interesting perspective. I had not heard it put that way exactly before.
Would you help me get it put that way?
I need to understand it a little bit better
Good. Let's
myself.
have more conversation
But
on
but
something.
I hear you. I really do hear what you're saying. And the suggestion is that we just don't understand it as well, and as we might think.
Without the right frame of reference, how could we?
Yeah. Yet we were more successful at it in the past with the population that we dealt with.
When it was less important.
Well, the group that came to America in the 1900s, well, it was, not everybody went to school. See, that was the difference. Everyone goes to school now.
And our society, even though it's so media rich on one hand, focuses on literacy because I had, you know what, can we go 10 or 15 minutes more? Or you had to get out of here?
I have to be at a thing at 4 o'clock. I do need just a few minutes to...
And all these things have to happen so much faster than thought that they can result in a self-talk story stream like we normally think to ourselves. So any time that gets spent disambiguating this code is time that's not available in this construction. And when I start working with people about teaching reading, the first thing I say is throw out all the models, stop, full stop, sit in front of a child, right? Let them read, and get first person, no theory, first person direct, get the correspondence between their articulation stutters and the confusions in the code as they're scanning through them. Right? So that you can actually see the ambiguity in the code correspond to the bogging in their brain as they process the code. Once you get that, then you can start to drop into track with them. Right? The next thing is to, we're rolling, right? The next thing is to get to the, sorry. The next thing is to bring in the shame, other levels of sensitivity that you can build on to now have this bridge between the adult, parent, caregiver, and what's actually happening in the child, not being mediated by somebody's model of what's going on in the child, but more grounded in the flow that's first-person experience.
Well, see, and you're talking about individual attention.
Yes.
You know,
I realize that.
even 20 kids in a room isn't going to make it.
Right. Well, if you're open to it, interested in it, from this framework, we've also developed a different way of intentionally confusing children about these different kinds of ambiguity, cueing them into how to know how to resolve them, and then passing on to the next one, and building an intentional bridge between the ABC song associational simplicity and the complex confusions of taking off into reading. But it's built at this kind of a ambiguity ground level.
But I don't want you to forget, you know, the affect that I'm talking about, which I think is different from the one that you talked about. A child will work beyond expectation for a teacher they feel good about.
Yes. Yes.
And that's a part of reading instruction.
Absolutely.
That's
Absolutely. The emotional scientist we were working with this morning, I mean, to him, everything starts with, they've defined the affects, there's 9 of them.
Mhm.
The spotlights,
Mhm.
right? The direct attention, cognition, and good direction. And that the main one for any kind of learning is interest. Interest, excitement, spectrum. So interest has to turn on, and inside that interest is where the learning is going to happen. If the interest isn't sufficient in its amplitude, there's not going to be any
Well,
learning.
you know, there's interest, and as you said, feeling good about yourself, wanting to do well for someone you think cares about you. All of those things are part and parcel. We've missed the boat a lot, too, with something as practical as spending a lot of time with narrative text and not expository text.
Yes.
In our definition of what a reader is. I had a wonderful discussion with a young woman who is a physician, and she was telling me about her 3 children, and she called 2 of them wonderful readers and one of them not a reader at all. So I started to ask her, why are these 2 readers and why is this one not? And so she said, well, you know, Ben and Shane read novels and just can't read enough. But Ariel, that's all she looks at is magazines and pop culture, and she likes ballet, so she reads something about that. Ariel's a reader about what she is interested in, and we tend to label people and even make people feel ashamed that they're not a reader if they don't love not fiction novels. The definition of a reader is you read fiction novels. And here, you know, this mother was labeling her daughter a non-reader, and she was a reader.
Yeah.
You know, a newspaper, directions.
Comic book. The point is to
Well,
engage the interest, right? To work that interest
You are a
into
reader
proficiency.
if you choose to read voluntarily for work or for pleasure. And I have often, my daughter has accused me of being a phony, she said to me, you don't read, Ma, you don't read novels. I read textbooks, I read journals. I actually thought of myself as not a reader for a very long time because I didn't read the traditional novels. And so that's another way.
That's better. If you're taking pleasure in your work and you read for work, then it's the same as reading a novel.
Absolutely.
It's a matter of whether your
Absolutely.
motivation is instrumental in utility or whether it's actually self-extension.
I got to see your collar.
I thought we were done.
Then,
Well, yeah, one's in and one's out.
yeah, one's in, one out, and I just wanted to pull them both out. Yeah.
There we go. Look great.
Thank you, thank you. I thought we were almost, not that I'm not enjoying this, I
I'm
am
enjoying
enjoying
this immensely. I'm
it.
enjoying this immensely. And I would like to arrange at some time, apart from the interview, if you're interested in that, to talk with you about the other things that we're doing and to see what kind of networking might be possible.
Sure.
And I'd love to set up some kind of an arrangement with the IRA about what we're doing here to make, in exchange for different kinds of help that we could be to each other, to make the license rights to this thing freely distributable within your organization if you think the content of it is warranted.
Unfortunately, I left without cards this morning. You can see what a business person I am.
I have your email address.
Fine, so that's all you need is my email address. And I will put you in contact with Rich because he's certainly, you know, someone who could deal with this sort of thing.
Sure.
You know, we are interested in collaborations if they kind of match what it is that we do.
Sure.
You know, and I once saw, you may be familiar with this, it was a Barbara Walters show, and John Stossel did the show, the piece, and it was on whole language versus phonics. I was appalled by it. It was dishonest, it was putting forth one view in a very skewed way, and I lost some respect where I had respect before and became more and more wary
Sure.
of you know, what I watch and so on, because the way whole language was presented was not fair,
Right.
you know, and the way phonics was presented was not fair, and a lot of statements were made that were not factual. So,
That's why I think it has to be put in perspective. This reading work thing has obscured the underlying realities of this process. It's not as simple as this.
No.
Not as simple as this is all. I mean, phonics is an attempt to compensate for the mess in the code. The whole language it rightfully derives from the notion that we're meaning-seeking, right? So they both have elements that are necessary, but that...
You must have come across ITA in your study, a
Yeah.
fascinating attempt to make the code easier.
After 100, I don't know if you've encountered this, my favorite story is the 1906 story of how Theodore Roosevelt's mistake doomed our approach to orthography. Have you heard that?
No.
In the 1880s, Melville Dewey, right, Dewey Decimal System, thinks that the spelling confusions pointed out by Ben Franklin and Noah Webster a century before lie at the ground of a social inequity, as Franklin had said. This is a massive problem. Years of extra trouble going on for kids. We got to do something to bring this and to fix it. He gets Charles Darwin, William James, Mark Twain, you name it, H.G. Wells later, and the best and brightest minds in the English-speaking world, hundreds of them, the U.S. Commissioner of Education, the Supreme Court justices, people from all over the world gather up, hundreds of them, into a convention distributed via mail to figure out what can we do with this mess. And they come up with a multi-generational staging system to shift the spelling back into something that's more phonetic. They list the first 300 words. This is what we're going to do this, and then 10 years from now we'll do that. It's a long-term process. One of the founders, architects of this, happens to be a friend of Theodore Roosevelt. So he goes to Theodore Roosevelt, tells Theodore Roosevelt about it. Roosevelt, his whole life's been ashamed of the fact he can't spell well. He says, damn it, this is great stuff. Sends a letter of instruction over to the Office of Government Printing in Washington, D.C. Says, from now on, the government will print this way. Pandemonium erupts all over the world. How dare a president muck around with something like spelling? The United States Congress and the Supreme Court get into a battle with the president about whether he can do it. It actually goes to the Supreme Court, Congress passes a resolution that presidents can't mess with the code. And meantime, the press, because this attempt to fix this thing was funded by Andrew Carnegie, he put $250,000 into this in the early 1900s. The press says, this whole thing is just a stinking scam by Andrew Carnegie, because if they adopt these new spellings, we'll have to change all the dictionaries and all the libraries, and Carnegie will make money with it. So a stink came over the whole idea of even thinking about this code.
And yet they did it with ITA. It's
But
amazing.
then they had the problem of transition.
Oh, right. Those people today still write ITA. It
But
taught us a
but
lot.
right there's another way. And that's the subject of our conversation after this.
Yeah, I mean, it taught us some stuff, ITA, actually.
Yes, yes. Thank you.